Do you have a favorite guitar player? So if you had to pick out one that stands out right now.
You'll be happy to know that Gilmour does have an answer to this question. There is one guitarist who stands out above the rest for Gilmour. You'll find out who before the end of the video. But there are so many incredible guitar players that David Gilmour counts among his influences that we just have to talk about, from Hendrix to Harrison and some you might not have known about. Hi, I'm Adam, welcome back to Music Mongoose. David Gilmour is undoubtedly one of the most talented guitar players the world has ever seen. His technical ability with the guitar has produced cerebral, emotive performances time and time again. His love for the guitar began early on, inspired by acts like Bill Haley and the Everly Brothers. Soon his love for music overtook that of academia, and he knew the path he wanted to take in life. Although school was something he definitely didn't enjoy, it was there that he'd meet Roger Waters and Syd Barrett. They didn't go to the same school as Gilmour, but the school was on the same road. Barrett and Gilmour would become closer at college though. They would practice the guitar together at lunchtimes, and although Gilmour never finished his college course, he did learn French during his time there. And he put this new skill to good use in 1965. Hitchhiking to Saint-Tropez in France. There he would meet up with Barrett and a few other friends. Gilmour spent a lot of time with Barrett in France. They even got arrested for busking. After this, of course, Syd Barrett would form Pink Floyd. In 1967, David Gilmour, on a brief trip back to London, decided to watch his old mates Syd Barrett and Roger Waters record their new track, See Emily Play. Unfortunately, Syd's mental health was really declining at that point, and he reportedly didn't recognise who David Gilmour was. Gilmour started covering for Syd and eventually replaced him entirely in Pink Floyd. Syd Barrett was one of Gilmour's early influences, and perhaps the most profound, definitely earning him a spot on Gilmour's list of his favourite guitarists. Syd was wildly talented, albeit sadly misguided. The two had been jamming since 1965 in England and France. Barrett's style would undoubtedly become early guidelines for Gilmour, mastering the vibrato and the manipulation of the strings, techniques he picked up from the late great Syd Barrett. It was in Pink Floyd that David Gilmour had the opportunity to turn his passion for the guitar into a full-blown career. From there, of course, he found great success and rose as one of the greatest guitar players ever. Along the way though, a few select guitar players would help mould David Gilmour into what he is today. Gilmour once told Uncut magazine, "Trying to be too original when you're too young is possibly not the best thing, but I learned copying Pete Seeger, Lead Belly, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, all sorts of people." And I think in the 60s and 70s, if you were to ask any guitar player who their influences were, they would definitely mention Clapton and Hendrix. In 1968, when Gilmour had joined Pink Floyd officially, it's clear that he'd been influenced by both Clapton and Hendrix. Clapton's phenomenal work with the Yardbirds and later Cream had influenced Gilmour greatly, as it did with many guitar players at that time. Clapton was labelled a guitar god, after all. However, when Jimi Hendrix joined Clapton and Cream for a jam session in 1966 at Regent Street Polytechnic, something changed. The scene was blown away. It was like a turning point for the possibilities in guitar playing. You see, Hendrix had essentially hopped on stage and given the guitar god, Eric Clapton, a run for his money. In fact, he dethroned Clapton on that night. Clapton later said in his biography, "I remember thinking that here was a force to be reckoned with. It scared me, because he was clearly going to be a huge star. And just as we were finding our own speed, here was the real thing." Buzz about Hendrix spread like wildfire. Hendrix's gig a few days after that jam session at the legendary Bag O' Nails was attended by the likes of Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, Jeff Beck, Paul McCartney, The Who, Eric Burdon, and John Mayall. Hendrix's guitar dominance was felt all over the guitar scene. Around the same time, Gilmour would see him play in South Kensington. The audience again was filled with top-class guitar talent. There was clearly something so special about Hendrix. This kid came in and strapped a right-handed guitar on the wrong way round. He was an absolute phenomenon from the beginning, he said about the performance. And Gilmour would cross paths with Hendrix again in France. Later, I was living in Paris, and one of the jobs outside of just playing with my little pop group there was that I was employed to take him round Paris for an evening, show him a good time, and he seemed very nice, likeable, shy. So Hendrix and Clapton right up there on the list of David Gilmour's favourite guitarists, and don't worry, we will get to his all-time favourites soon. Another massive influence on Gilmour, and indeed the entire 60s rock and blues scene, is of course Chuck Berry. You could argue, without Chuck Berry, there would be no rock and roll as we know it. Berry's influence is heard all over the scene, in Gilmour's work and his contemporaries. So it's a safe bet that Gilmour counts Berry among his favourite guitar players. Hank Marvin of the Shadows is also one of Gilmour's early influences. He's among Keith Richards' favourites too. Gilmour once told Guitar Tricks Insider that he counts the Shadows' greatest hits album at the top for the most essential albums to own. It's easy to forget that the Shadows were just as big as the Beatles in many parts of the country, so it's easy to see why Marvin would become one of Gilmour's favourite guitar players. Oh, and speaking of the Beatles, they taught me how to play guitar. I learnt everything, the bass parts, the lead, the rhythm, everything. They were fantastic. George Harrison was a massive influence for David Gilmour. It kickstarted his admiration for the guitar in a pop sense as well as a rock and roll sense. The list of Gilmour's favourite guitar players doesn't stop there. In interviews over the years, he's mentioned his admiration and respect for the likes of Pete Seeger, Lead Belly, Joni Mitchell, John Fahey, Roy Buchanan, and tons more. He once said, "I copied. Don't be afraid to copy." And eventually something that I suppose that I would call my own appeared. And perhaps that's the mark of not just a good guitar player, but a great one. That ability and humility to recognize and absorb great guitar players and their abilities and use that to inform your own style. There is, however, one person that stands out, one guitar player that sits at the top of David Gilmour's favourite guitar players list.
Probably the person who I have admired the longest and the most consistently is Jeff Beck.
The late, great Jeff Beck is the guitarist's guitarist. He's so often hailed as one of the most influential guitar players in rock. He would become one of the most sought-after players in Britain, among the likes of Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton. Of course, these three names have something in common: the Yardbirds, the group with which Beck would burst onto the scene. From there, he continued to soar with Beck's Bolero, the Jeff Beck Group, and of course his incredible solo career as well. Famously, it was Beck that Pink Floyd wanted to hire before David Gilmour. Apparently though, according to Nick Mason, they didn't have the nerve to approach him. Gilmour had first become aware of Jeff Beck through his time in the Yardbirds. He quickly recognised and admired his talent as a player, especially when it came to the blues. Gilmour not only respected his technical ability, but also the ability to stay adventurous. His ability to always stay one step ahead of the rest. His ability to always find new ways to challenge himself. In 2015, Gilmour told Guitar World, "I'm sort of horribly pathetically fanish about Jeff. Ever since Hi-Ho Silver Lining came out in 1967, when I was 20-odd years old, I've revered him and his playing. In many ways, he is just the best guitar player. And 40-something years since he came to prominence in the Yardbirds, he is still the only person pushing forward in that way. He's never retreading old ground. He's always looking for a new challenge." He continued, "Jeff's scarily brilliant. He's a tightrope walker. I'm not. I like to cover all my bases and make myself secure with a great band, with the music all rehearsed. I just walk out there, and if I didn't even play anything, it would still sound great. Jeff's different. He's out there mining that seam." In 2009, Gilmour performed Hi-Ho Silver Lining with Beck on stage at London's Royal Albert Hall, the song that initially started Gilmour's infatuation with Beck. That must have been an incredible moment for David Gilmour. And in 2018, Gilmour labelled Beck as a maverick guitar player who doesn't like to repeat himself, who takes big risks all the time, and has done all the way throughout his career. Remember earlier when I said Gilmour chose the Shadows' greatest hits album as the top essential album to own? Well, he chose Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow as his number 2. So a pretty good choice, I think, for David Gilmour's all-time favourite guitar player. Did you know, though, that Jeff Beck had an uncomfortable rivalry with Eric Clapton in the 60s and 70s? Click over here to watch that one next.